Great. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your evenings as it is in your time zones, your respective time zones right now. So students who've joined us for joining us for this panel, we're really excited to talk about having experience abroad. And this conversation really came about through students' voice. And this is one of the workshops that we like to put on based on what student interests are in. And so if you have further comments, questions, or want to have conversations about something similar or another workshop, feel free to shoot either Parrish or myself an email. Our contact information is on the Vanderbilt Career Center website, and we'll drop that link in chat as well. But for now, thank you all for joining us. What we'll do is we have a few questions that we're going to ask our panelists, and that'll take about 45 minutes. From there, we'll go and we'll let the students ask questions. We'll open up for hopefully 15 to 20 minutes for you to ask questions that you have for the panelists. So we are joined and very thankful to have Alana Barron, who is in Copenhagen, Denmark, class of 2015. Also, Michael Scherer, class of 2008 in Zurich, Switzerland. And we also have Jennifer Kwan, class of 2013, working in Paris, France, but because of restrictions, we found out not stationed there currently, but she will return there at some point. So with that, I'm just going to lead into the first question that we have for panelists, and I'll let Michael open it up here if you don't mind. I'd love to hear from the three of you if you could briefly describe what you do in your current role and what a typical day looks like for you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul, and nice to meet you all on the call here. Hopefully I can provide some helpful insights. So I work for Roche Pharmaceuticals, our office is in Basel. I live in Zurich, so it's a bit of a long commute in non-COVID times, but 100% working from home these days. And so my role at Roche, I'm on the commercial side in a group called Digital and Personalized Healthcare Partnering. So we're responsible for understanding the needs of the organization from a technology, services, data perspective, and identifying and executing partnerships with companies in what we call digital and personalized healthcare. So I started that role a couple of weeks ago, just at the beginning of the year. I was in a different part of the organization prior to that. So I'm learning about my new role on a day-by-day basis, but that's the general gist of it. Paul, does that help? Do you want me to, should I keep going?
No, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. Jennifer, if you don't mind going next.
Hi there, Jennifer Kwan, class of 2013. I currently work at UNESCO as a consultant in change management in the IT department. So I started in February 2020, so it was right before everything happened. So actually my initial plan and the ideas of what I was going to do actually look very different than what I do now. When I started, I was in the office and was going to be part of the rollout of the digitalization of all of the workforce, how we do meetings, team management, records keeping, etc. And we were supposed to have at least 6 months for the planning and initialization phase, and then we were going to slowly roll it out across field offices, headquarters, and all of our member states. With COVID, my day-to-day looks completely different. It's basically whatever crisis we have, if we have a new situation, and really helping and working with the team on how we can introduce these digital collaboration tools. So whether it is on communications and how can we increase messages about what are these tools, how do we use them, creating user guides on how we can, use tutorials on how to even log in and use them. Or a lot of times what I also do is I act as a bridge between the IT support team, or the people who have actually created and used these tools and implemented them, and our day-to-day users and colleagues. So a lot of troubleshooting, a lot of colleague support, and a lot of conversations about that.
Awesome, thank you. Alana.
Yes. Hi, I'm Alana. I study elementary education at Vanderbilt, and I am now a second grade teacher at an international school in Copenhagen. So the day-to-day is pretty similar to what I would be doing as a teacher in the US, but the difference is that my students are from all over the world, and so are my colleagues. It's a very international environment. We speak English at school, which is very helpful. But yeah, basically it's very similar to what I would be doing at a school in the US.
That's awesome. So really excited to have a diverse range of work exposed here in this panel. So with that, as I mentioned prior, this panel really came about from student interest of wanting to work abroad and wanting to have experience in a new country that is not their origin country. And so with that, I mentioned here, and feel free to jump in as you think of your answer, what interested you about working in another country in the first place, and how did you get started in that process?
I could share. I first became interested in working in Denmark because I did a study abroad program here when I was at Vanderbilt. So I did a summer program in Copenhagen and fell in love with the city. And then while I was there, I had been studying education, of course, and learning about the Nordic models and approaches to education and early childhood. And from working in the US for a few years, I think that the Nordic approach is very refreshing and very aligned kind of with my educational philosophy. And so it seemed like it would actually be a very good fit for me as a teacher, and also just because it's a great place to live. So I worked in the US for a few years and then started applying to jobs here.
I'll go ahead. Yeah, so I studied biomedical engineering at Vanderbilt and was fortunate to figure out how to fit in studying abroad when I was my junior year. I lived in Madrid, and I didn't really have a career plan to come back to Europe at any point, but I worked after business school. I worked for a consulting firm in Chicago, where I'm originally from, and spent a couple of years at that consulting firm. And an opportunity came up with one of the partners I worked with. He is just transferring to the Zurich office. I really liked working with him. And so it was just kind of a new opportunity. I had never been to Switzerland or Zurich before, and I'd heard it's a great place to live. And now I don't really ever want to leave. I love it here. So yeah, we'll see what the future brings. But yeah, it's a great place to be.
Okay, I can go. Speaking very frankly, I never had a plan, especially when I was in undergrad and thinking of what I wanted to do, where I wanted to do it. I never had a plan to work in Europe, never thought that I would need to learn French and live in France. Initially, my heart was in Asia. My heart is still in Asia. I'm Chinese American. That's where my heritage is. I studied Chinese for two and a half years at Vanderbilt. I did a summer abroad in Shanghai, and actually I started working in Shanghai as soon as I graduated. So from 2013 to end of 2016, I was working in Shanghai in education consulting. And that for me was my heart. I loved it, and I actually wanted to go back, whether it was in Singapore or Hong Kong or another city in China, and keep working there. But life sometimes changes, and what drew me to France was that I was looking for something to kind of jumpstart my career and to take me to just a different path. And so I ended up getting my MBA in France. And then once I'd gotten the MBA, I was still intending to go back to China. But then I ended up finding work, I got married, and now I'm still here in France 4 years later.
Crazy how those things work out. You just kind of continue down the trend that you're working in. That's great to hear. Thank you all for sharing. And one of the biggest hurdles, I would say, and not speaking from my own experience, just still being in the US, but is the work eligibility aspect of working in another country. So would you all mind walking through what that process of obtaining that work eligibility was like for your respective countries? And were there any surprises, or on the flip side, anything that went smoother than you expected?
I can go. Nothing about my process was smooth, and maybe Switzerland is unique in that it's an incredibly document-heavy process. But I would basically the way it works. If you have an employer that will sponsor your work visa in Switzerland, they go about, at least my company managed that process for me. even just switching offices within the same company, the process took like 5 or 6 months before I got the visa approval. And I didn't have a ton of insight into actually what that process really looked like because they were managing it. I was fortunate to have an employer that took care of that. And now I just I don't have a long-term visa still. I've been here almost 3 years. After 5 years, you're eligible to apply for like the next level visa that's more permanent. So if we stay here for another couple of years, I'll have the opportunity to do that. But in the meantime, I reapply for the visa, and given that I'm employed by a company here, it's just a formality, but I just have to do that sort of annual renewal of the visa. So yeah, that was without diving into a lot of the details. It took a long time and was not smooth.
No, completely agree. Michael, I hear you on the visa, on the paperwork, on the admin. I totally get it. I don't want to scare all of you though, because of course, working abroad is definitely, it is an opportunity. It's life-changing. And I mean, I'm still working abroad 7, 8 years later, but there are a lot of details and a lot of administrative headaches that come with the territory, and they're things that you have to do. And sometimes you think, oh, if I was in the US, this would be so much easier. I wouldn't have to do this. I wouldn't have to get translators for all of my documents, etc. But at the same time, I think it's very worth it. So in France, there's actually a particular rule that in order for a French employer to be able to hire an international candidate, they have to prove that they were not able to hire someone from the local candidacy pool. So a lot of times that means that they have to either do recruitment, they have to show proof that they've interviewed other people, they have to show that they have not been able to find it from the local candidacy, and that's why they can extend your offer. However, though, if you can demonstrate expert status, or that you are somehow an expert or a candidate who has value to add to the French society, so in the case of perhaps having, for example, an MBA or a higher degree that was received in France, that helps to kind of cut that. So when I did my MBA, I remember they had workshops, which I skipped because I had no intention of staying in France, but life changes. But my friends who went there told me that the reason that a lot of them, it would be easier to obtain the visa and to have that work eligibility was that you would be able to go present your degree, present the type of student visa that you had as proof of your capabilities, as proof of your value in French society. That would ensure that they could be able to cut out that candidacy evaluation process. So a little bit more straightforward, but still definitely not, I would say, easy.
Yeah, so Denmark is also strict. There are basically 2 ways to get a work visa in Denmark. The first one is if you are offered a high-paying job, which would be considered over like $65,000 a year, or there's a list of jobs where there's a shortage of professionals in Denmark called the positive list. And so if you are offered a job that is on that list, you can get a visa that way as well. So the list is like constantly updated, and basically sometimes teachers are on it and sometimes they're not. So I had applied just to schools, and at one point was offered a position when it would have been on the positive list, and they were going to apply for the visa for me. And again, the employer takes care of it if it's a work visa. And that time it didn't go through in time, so I had to stay in the US. And then I ended up marrying a Dane, so I applied for a marriage visa. But while I was applying for that, I also applied for my current job. For my other, it's a little convoluted. But I applied and was offered basically my current position before my marriage visa was approved. And so again, the school applied for the work visa for me. They were approved at the same time. And so now I'm here on the marriage visa with the right to work. But it is possible to get the work visa. And the work visas process much faster than the marriage visas, and are honestly a lot more straightforward. So it's a good way to go if you can.
Sounds like just getting organized as early as you can and having just a list, a checklist of all the things you need to get done is probably the best thing to do. Well, it sounds like a process it's manageable. You just have to stay organized and stay on top of it. Thank you all for sharing that. So now I want to transition to expectations versus reality. Now that you're there, you're living in the country, visas are all approved. What were some of those expectations versus realities of both working in the country that you're in, but on top of that, just acclimating to a different culture?
Sure. I mean, if any of you have seen the Netflix series Emily in Paris, you know, we're all quarantined. I see some nods. Okay. It's not at all like that. I came to Paris, and the reason I chose Paris for my MBA, or France actually, it wasn't directly in Paris, but I had my MBA in a city that was nearby, is because I had come to Paris as a tourist, and I just thought it was such an interesting city, and I wanted something different from China, so why not? The reality is very, very different from being a tourist versus being an actual citizen or an actual resident when you're living on a day-to-day. And I think there's a lot of things that I didn't expect to miss about the US, like random ability to go to the store or get certain things. I was actually just talking to a friend the other day about Target, and I would love to be able to go to a Target. And there are other stores and there are other things, but there are just certain things that you miss. I think that the language was really important. And for me, when I was not speaking French, I had no problem doing my day-to-day, and you get into a routine. But when I decided, okay, I'm going to stay here, I'm going to start making my life here. You know, I got married to my Frenchie here and started actually learning the language. And now I do speak French. I've seen a big difference because I feel like that kind of assimilation has led to a more nuanced but also appreciative view of France and the culture and the people, etc. So maybe it's a little less romanticized than I would have thought, especially, oh, it looks pretty on Instagram, or, oh, but I saw this series and it looked really nice. Those are all true. There are so many magical moments that will stay with you. But there's also a lot of other things that come with it. So I think it's also realizing that just because you pick a country because you love it, it doesn't mean it's always going to be romantic. It's always going to be Instagram worthy, but that it's worth it if this is something that you want to do and you want to pursue it. And maybe if you work abroad only for a year or two and you decide, no, this isn't for me, that's okay. But if you also live and you decide to make your life in another country, then that's great also. But I think it's just very interesting to realize that no matter where you go, whether you stay in the US, but you move to a different city, different state, et cetera, we always have expectations. None of us could have ever foreseen COVID as it is now. And yet here we all are. Yet we're all able to meet and still be able to have this interesting international experience and share our stories. And so I think that, you know, in spite of all of the ups and downs, I wouldn't change it at all. But definitely, if I had to say one thing, I would say that the language has made a big difference for me. Not speaking French versus speaking French now. That has made a really big difference in feeling more integrated and even more confident in the country. When I go, I don't have to worry. I go to the bakery or I go to the store or I have a customer complain I need to return an item. I can feel confident that when I go there, I'll be respected. I can make myself heard. Because I feel like as an expat, sometimes you feel like you don't have a voice. Maybe you don't speak the language, the culture is different, visa situation, etc.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you said. There are definitely things that I miss in the US that I did not expect to miss. I miss the grocery stores. I think they are so much better there in the US. But other things that were surprising in a good way, work culture here. I feel like we'll probably get into this later, but work culture is very different here. Denmark is very heavily unionized, which is great for teachers. So I feel like, and they're very intent on like work-life balance, and you're a person outside of your job. And that is very refreshing. And so I feel like just the experience of working here is a lot better than, number one, than it was in the US for me as a teacher, and number two, than I expected here, because there were so many times where they would say, oh, you're entitled to do this and you're allowed to do that. And I'd be like, oh, really? That's awesome. So there's that aspect of it, which is really nice. Things that are hard. Denmark is, or has been, a very homogenous country. People are very similar. There's a lot of kind of unwritten rules in society and just things that everyone here gets and they kind of expect you to get. And so there's definitely been a lot of moments where where you can feel a little bit alienated when you realize that you have done something wrong. Although they're always very nice about it. But yeah, and then the language is another thing that I was surprised by. Danish is a difficult language, but I think learning it is made more difficult by the fact that everyone here actually speaks really good English. And so I thought that I tried to learn Danish before I came, but I was like, oh, when I actually go there, I'll practice all the time. But the reality is that they hear an accent and they switch to English right away. And so it was really hard to just get the practice and become comfortable speaking Danish. It probably took like 1.5 to 2 years before I would do it in public and be persistent. So that's one thing about Denmark specifically. But I agree that it was worth the effort of learning the language because I do feel so much more, confident and comfortable, and I'm part of society, and know what's going on. And there's fewer of those surprise unwritten rule moments now that I can communicate a little better.
So common thread, learning the language. Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to add in, you all mentioned learning the language, right? Obviously, it's a pretty big piece of going to a new country. What resource or app did you all use to learn a new language? Did you use books, audiobooks, Duolingo, other apps? What resources did you all take advantage of?
I can share. I mean, I would just +1 to both Jennifer and Alana on the language. I mean, so Zurich is in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and it's been, my one regret is not taking more intensive classes earlier, because to Jennifer's point, being able to speak the language just helps with integration so much. I mean, you definitely here, you don't need to speak German, but it's better if you speak Swiss German, which I still haven't fully learned. But being able to speak the language, I really like the comment of just sort of being more comfortable and confident. And the way I've learned it is through one-on-one classes with a tutor. I think really for me, just having the mindset of with any language, being willing to make mistakes and sort of put yourself out there, and you have to just sort of experiment, and it's painful and sometimes very embarrassing, but it's how you learn. So yeah, that's I guess what I would share. I guess I would also say on the apps, I tried using the apps and it didn't work for me. But maybe that's just me.
I also tried Duolingo before I came here. I thought it was helpful for learning basic vocabulary and just kind of starting to get a feel for how it sounds. But I had to eventually, I got a book with a CD that went with it that was more helpful, that got me to kind of the basic level where I could take a proficiency test and pass, the most basic proficiency test. But there was really no substitute for actually speaking and listening to people. Danish is it's not a phonetic language at all. Things don't look like they sound. So if you're not talking to people, there's no way to get good at it on your own. So as soon as I could, I signed up for Danish classes, and they would be 10 to 12 people in a class with a teacher. And that was the absolute most helpful thing. Very worth it.
No, completely agree. I think for me, the most important thing was to actually start using it. And because for the first year that I was in France, I didn't think that I was staying, so I didn't actually bother to learn the language. But once I decided and thought, okay, this is where I'm going to be making my home, I actually ended up quitting my job. I was working in English for an international company that was a video game startup in France. And so we had so many different cultures, so many different nationalities. We all spoke in English. And while it was really interesting, I wasn't learning. And even though I was taking classes, I had the applications, I changed my phone, you change your computer settings, you change everything in French, but I wasn't integrating as much because I wasn't using it on a day-to-day basis. So I quit my job, I took a year off, and I studied French full time. So I studied, I had books. I actually came and I lived with the in-laws for quite a few months and was just speaking, studying. I felt like a child because we had like the grammar exercises and the pronunciation and how to move your mouth and do the certain syllables, which is completely how to roll the R's, which I've never been very good at. And it was hard because it was definitely an investment. And I'm not saying that everyone has to do this. This was just my particular situation. But in order for me to be able to get to the level that I wanted to be and to be able to feel comfortable communicating with my in-laws and speaking it, I felt like this was something that I really needed to do, because if I didn't do it then, I was never going to do it. So I did. And now I speak French and I feel very confident now. And I think that that was the best decision that I could have made for myself.
That's awesome. That's really great to hear. I know I took a few German classes in college, and that took a little bit of time to adjust. So I'm sure taking a year off and having a tutor and all the things you all have to do to become fluent, very necessary. But it's great to hear. I want to backtrack a little bit to Alana. You were mentioning work culture. And I want to talk about that for a second. And I want to hear from the three of you. What cultural differences did you notice in the office or out of the office, around colleagues? What were some of the differences you noticed? And not just from an office standpoint, maybe you can relay the information in terms of from school in the U.S. and kind of relate those two peer to peer.
I can kick it off. Yeah, so I mean, work culture, the company I work for, Roche, is very international. So the native Swiss that it's headquartered here are few and far between. I think in general, the work culture here is people work pretty hard, but then they take off weekends. Like I was accustomed to working a little bit on the weekends in the United States, that people don't really do that here, which is nice for that to be the norm. And then, yeah, I mean, maybe it's just specific to my company, but since it is so international, like it's like, it's just really fun to meet people from different backgrounds, and everybody that's part of the getting to work with a team, or figuring out how to work with a new set of colleagues, is understanding if there are any cultural norms or ways of working that people are accustomed to and you want to be respectful of, and just being very upfront and transparent about any specific ways that people like to work. And I find that having those conversations, like, you kind of get to know people as well. So I love that aspect of it. But yeah, and Paul, I think I missed the second part of your question, but maybe that was helpful.
Yeah, I was just, I guess I kind of fumbled my words there. I was just thinking in terms of, if you couldn't think of ways to describe the work experience translation, thinking about it of your experience in undergrad and having classes, internships, to your work culture now, just as some students might not have full-time work experience.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I'm thinking, yeah, it's a good question. The internships that I had in college, I don't know. I'm not sure if there are any parallels. I wish looking back on them, I wish I had been a little bit more proactive and aggressive in taking on projects that I did, but I'm not sure that has any relevance to any parallel to what I'm doing now. Yeah.
So I talked a little bit about work culture, but I can add a little bit more. I mean, the standard work week here is 37 and a half hours. And like Michael was saying, it's most people, if you're not at work, you are not working. And that's, I think, really nice because it is expected that you have friends and family and hobbies, and you should have time for those things. Like, your job is your job. It's not your whole life. And so people take their time off very seriously. You're entitled to 5 weeks of vacation, and people take 5 weeks of vacation every year. Also, like, if you have a sick day, you just take a sick day, and no one is going to be on your case about it. So to me, I feel like there's just kind of a lot more understanding of like the humanness of the employee. I think that's true at my school, but also just in general here. I also know that in, I guess, more traditional or like corporate workplaces, they don't really have so much of a hierarchy. It's a more flat missing the word, but a lot of, no matter kind of what level you are in a company, you are seen as like equals. A lot of times, like CEOs don't even have their own office. They just kind of work with everybody else to kind of create this feeling of like equality in the workplace, which I also think is really nice. One other, when you brought up the comparison to school and like internships, I know that when I was student teaching, we were always being told like, be really careful what you put on social media because you need to be professional in like all senses of the word, and you should do that. But here, I remember talking to someone here and them saying like, oh, that's crazy. No one would ever look at your social media and not hire you because you were drinking in a picture or something. And so I think it just ties back to, they don't expect you to like be all work all the time, and they expect you to do other things outside, and that's okay. So, but you should be professional also in the US.
No, I completely agree about the work-life balance and how I've heard it said before that in more European countries or even in France, it's more like you work to live rather than living to work. And I think that's really true. Like nobody is expected to take their work home with them. So I've actually worked in 3 different places. Well, 4 if you count the internships. I worked for Publicis Media, and I worked in the digital marketing branch of that. And then I worked for the startup video game company, and now I work for UNESCO. So I feel like I've kind of experienced a lot of different gamuts of the different cultures there. But things like taking a lunch break every single day. And the French love their lunch break. They love their food. They like to take their time. It's very rare. It does happen, of course. Sometimes days will just be super crazy. They go get a sandwich and then they just, they eat it at their desk, but that's very, very rare. A lot of times they go, multiple people, you go, you have multiple courses, you sit down, you talk a bit. And that's very interesting for me because I was more used to a culture where we didn't always take time even for a lunch break. So that's something that I actually really appreciate. And the vacation, if any of you are seniors applying for jobs or whatnot in France, just know that between the months of July and August, that's pretty much known as the dead months because everybody's presumed to be on vacation. I wasn't this year because of COVID, but that's fine. So if you don't receive a response, that might be why, but it's just very culturally integrated where July and August, people are presumed to take 1 to 2 months off. They're on vacation. Nobody thinks badly of them. Nobody judges them. It's just the way that there is. The other thing that was very interesting for me, and I'm not sure if maybe this is the same in other countries, but a lot of people use the smoke time or the time when they would smoke to break as a way of socialization. I don't smoke, so there were a lot of times when I would feel a bit maybe isolated, but I found ways, you can propose to get a coffee or you have a drink or you have some water or tea or you stand with them as they're smoking. And so that could be a way of integration too. But that was interesting for me to see how smoking is such a social activity and it's something that they really use to catch up, to talk, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned kind of the social aspect of it, right? And so I kind of want to stay on that trend and think of it in terms of networking. Obviously, we say the word networking all the time, and it's so big, you hear it everywhere. Students might laugh every time they hear the word networking, but in terms of platforms, so in the US, obviously, LinkedIn and company job boards or company websites, right? Networking is a great way to get involved with the company. Are there any platforms, websites, or resources that you all see in your country be kind of a leading force in networking? Is it the same as LinkedIn? What are some resources that you all might have if a student's looking to meet other people in your country?
I'd say everyone here is pretty much on LinkedIn. There might be others, but I think that's still the main one here that I know of.
Yeah, same. Oh, no, go Michael.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I use LinkedIn. I can't remember exactly when I moved here, maybe like did a search on people that live in Switzerland to see if I didn't know anybody and, somebody in my network that I'd forgotten, lived here. That's helpful. I also, just right before COVID started, went to a Vanderbilt alumni network event, which was an incredible way to get to know some people here that I hadn't met. And unfortunately, they've postponed the events due to COVID restrictions, but that is also a great platform, depending on where you end up.
Yeah, so LinkedIn definitely is one. Facebook is interesting, as there are a lot of expat groups, especially in Paris, that I've joined and that have been useful. Everything from talking about visas, talking about getting your driver's license. I'm in the process of doing that, which means I have to learn how to drive stick. And there's a lot of other expats who are in the similar boat. It's interesting though, and I'll try and make this short, but I actually have very strong views on the word networking because, again, I want to, I got my MBA from a school that really stressed networking events. You have the business card, you give them, you wear the suit, you look very professional, and make sure that your LinkedIn has the great title and the perfect picture and the right keywords so that you'll show up when the recruiter is searching. To be very honest, LinkedIn never really worked for me. I've never gotten a job through LinkedIn. And if somebody has, please tell me what I need to do to improve that. But for what I've really found is more than just using LinkedIn as a way to connect with someone and ask, oh, I see you work for this company. Can you help me get a job? I don't know you. And to recommend you would mean that I have to know your skill set or know what you're capable of. But rather for me, it's really those personal connections. So like connecting with fellow expats or connecting with people that are in my circle or I know, sharing our stories. And once they know your capabilities, they know what you're capable of, I think that's the best opportunity, whether you're looking for a change of job, you're looking to change an apartment, etc. It's through those real relationships and connections. And that's not to mean that you have to be there in person. Like even if people reach out, if you reach out to us on LinkedIn, of course, I'm sure any three of us will be happy to speak to you. If you want to have a conversation, you want to know more about the country. But if you come to us and you add me and you say, I'm really interested in this, can you help me get a job? Or I applied for this, can you somehow help me? We might not be able to because it's a bit limited, and also we don't have that connection. So yes, I do agree. I think that networking is even something that we're doing now. And it's useful and it enables us to meet each other, but it's really those connections and those personal relationships that I think actually lead to real opportunities. At least that's what I
completely agree.
Yeah, I would also completely agree with that. Facebook groups are huge here, especially among expat communities. And also, it was my teacher from my study abroad program that introduced me to the principal at my school. So I didn't get the job till a couple of years later, but that was my initial connection, was a personal relationship. So yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, every single job, or the reason me moving to Switzerland was because of a specific person that I knew well and had a very strong relationship with, no doubt.
Great, yeah, that's a great piece of advice, and I definitely agree with that as well. It's always great to have conversations and meet people professionally, but really having the opportunity to introduce yourself and learn who they are, and have them learn who you are as well, and kind of breaking down that barrier. 100%. That was great piece of advice there. And so the last thing I have to ask, and then I'll open it up, if any students have any questions, if you all just have any general advice that you would give to a student looking to work in another country, or kind of final statements in a sense of what the student should look for, or look into, or do to help.
I guess I would just share, I think there's a lot of value in getting a different perspective, which is part of living somewhere else. It doesn't mean that you have to go do that, but if that's something that you think has value, it's worth considering living in another country, because reading the newspapers there, or getting speaking to different people, it's good to have a bit of a different perspective from somewhere else in the world, but it's also absolutely not not required or necessarily better than staying in the United States or anything.
I can also share.
I'd say that. I mean,
oh, Zoom problems. So this is from my experience in education, which I know is very different from other industries. So you guys can say if you think it's relevant. But I mean, for me, I think what worked was finding schools that I thought would actually be good fits for me, reaching out to people personally there and being persistent. It did take a few tries before I actually got my job. So I think that like, don't go like searching at random, but actually try to be purposeful about where you're applying to make sure that it's a good fit for you and that you would be a good fit for them. And the second thing is that it can be really hard, I think, to get your resume or your CV even looked at if you're from abroad. And so the personal connections are really helpful, but it also can be really helpful to have some kind of connection to the country to show like why you're specifically interested in the company or the country, especially if they're going to sponsor a work visa for you. They want to know that you're worth the investment and you're going to stay. And they're not just going to spend thousands of dollars or whatever it is sponsoring a visa for someone who's going to go back home and then they need to find someone new. So I think be purposeful about where you're applying, use the personal connections, and try to make it really clear that like you are committed to it if you get the opportunity.
Absolutely. Completely agree with that. That connection to country can be really useful and also help to justify if this is your first work experience, you can show this is why I'm interested, and employees, especially if they're going to sponsor a visa. And there's usually, at least in France, there's a huge financial commitment on the part of the company that they have to make in order to sponsor that visa. So they want to be sure that they're going to be able to have a good return on investment for that. For me, it would be, I think we talked a bit about the expectation versus reality. And I think when you make the decision to work abroad and it's exciting and it's new and you get there and then it kind of starts to wear off, and it can be very easy to make comparisons. Oh, but it's different in my home country. It's different in America, or this is easier, and to keep making those comparisons, or to feel like, oh, this is better in this place. And I think that that's cheating yourself a bit. And that could be whether you're traveling or living, because there's a lot that each country offers if you're open to that experience. And then the other one, I think, is from a very personal standpoint, but maybe we can all understand this given the current pandemic, is I think it's very normal to feel lonely and to feel isolated, especially if you move and you don't have a support system, you don't have a partner, you don't have family nearby, etc. And I think that that's okay, and that's part of that experience. And that's why I encourage all of you, if you do make this decision, to meet other expats who are there, because they'll be able to share the same experiences, or even if they haven't had the exact same experiences, they've probably experienced similar feelings or emotions, and you can share that together, so that even though, yes, they might be new and you might be outside of your community or your comfort zone, but you can meet other people who have had and will be able to share in that with you.
Thank you all really great piece of advice. And for the last 45 minutes, thank you for answering my questions that I've had for you all. So for now, I want to open it up for students. If you have questions that you want to ask panelists, feel free either to drop your question in chat. Parrish and I will be watching that. And on top of that, if you want to just take your mic off mute and ask your question, feel free to do so as well.
I'll go ahead and throw a question out there. Hi, my name is Morgan. I'm a first year at Vanderbilt, and I think for myself and for any other undergraduates who are here, I know I'm definitely curious to hear a little bit more just about how your undergraduate experience and what you studied at Vanderbilt helped to inform what you do now, and any advice you would have for maximizing your time while here at Vanderbilt to prepare for that work experience, especially going abroad.
I can share. I mean, going back to the importance of, or potential importance of, relationships. I mean, my first job out of undergrad, I studied biomedical engineering, and my first job was working for one of my professor's startup companies. And so I only got that job because I did okay in his classes. I didn't do great, but we got to establish a relationship. And yeah, I mean, I guess my advice for you, especially as a first year, is to try and just experiment with as many things outside of class, from whether it's an internship or I don't know, just really just trying a lot of different things, because you don't know like what it is that you're going to enjoy doing. Some of my favorite things were the side projects I got to do with a professor, or wasn't necessarily a formal internship, but being very proactive about, thinking about, what are your interests and trying to identify opportunities outside of the class that, can help you sort of understand, okay, I like this part of that experience, but maybe not this other part. And then you just sort of accelerate your own learnings about what you like.
So I already said that my interest in Copenhagen began when I came to study abroad. But also the reason I came to Copenhagen was because it was the only program that I could get a credit towards my major for. It was not because I was like, oh, Denmark. So yeah, I think be open-minded, definitely. And going abroad is obviously a huge opportunity if you're able to do it. I have another friend who did a semester abroad in Vienna. She was a piano major. And she got an internship at the Opera House while she was there, learned German. And so by the time she had finished her semester abroad, she basically was set up to have a job after graduation. She ended up going and doing her master's at like the conservatory there, and she's still working in Europe, playing piano and like living her dream. So it's a huge opportunity. I know not everyone is able to do it, but you can really use that to your advantage if you know that it's something that you want to pursue afterwards, or even if you don't, and then you still have the experience that you can go back to if you realize that it's something that you want.
Mine was interesting because from freshman, sophomore, junior, and mid-senior year, I thought I was going to law school. Clearly I didn't, but that's what I thought. So I studied communications, English, and I minored in sociology. And I thought that all of that was gearing me up towards law school because that was what people told me I would be good at. And I thought, okay, this is something that I think I might be interested in. And then doing some soul searching, I think it was during my senior year, I thought maybe that's not what I want to do for me. And I don't want to do something because other people tell me that I should do it or that I would be good at it. So I ended up changing completely. And since then, I don't know that you can really put my career into a title, which is interesting because in LinkedIn, you're supposed to put like a title or what is my sector. And I don't really have one. I work in the IT department right now. That's not communication, but I've been able to use what I studied and things that I enjoyed. So the communications aspect, or being able to share messages and to be able to help with, solve common problems, and being able to use that. And I've been able to apply that in all of the jobs that I've done. So I think the biggest thing that I learned during university is, how do I work? What do I like? What are subjects that get me interested? And you're not going to find a job where you do something that you love all of the time. Even if the job is something you love, you will have to do things that were not on your, what is it called? That weren't on the list of responsibilities, or you will end up doing things that were completely unexpected. But if you know what your skill sets are and you know what you like and you know what your strengths are, I think that really helps in making an informed decision about the jobs that we do take.
I would also add, not related to studying abroad, but what Jennifer was saying earlier about how like they need to exhaust the local applicant pool before they can go to someone abroad. I think as long as you're at Vanderbilt and you're getting a world-class education, like just focus on being really good at what you want to do. Because I think that going to Peabody, which is a great education school, gave me a lot of confidence going into my career, and knowing just, I mean, like I didn't feel super confident my first couple of years, but I knew by the time that I was applying to jobs here, I was like, I am a good teacher. I have a great background, and I know that I'm going to add value to a school here. And I know that schools that I was applying to, like they saw things in my experience and in me as an applicant that obviously made them think, yes, we want her, compared to people that are already available and don't need a visa. So if you kind of know what if you're like Jennifer, maybe you go in a lot of different directions, but if you have an idea of what you would want to do abroad, just try to focus on honing your skill set, being an expert in whatever it is that you do, so that when you do apply to jobs abroad, you stand out.
Thank you, Morgan. Great question. We have a question in chat. Do resumes/CV formats work in the same way in Europe as they do in the US?
Oh, this was a shocker for me. I remember going in my MBA and we did a resume workshop or something like that. In France, they have you put a picture next to your name. And that was, yeah, okay, so same. That was very shocking for me. And initially I resisted it because I thought, no, that's I don't like that. I don't want them to judge me based on what I look like in the US. You don't do that. And then eventually I caved, and now I have my picture.
Yeah, you also put a picture on your CV here, and it is a CV, not a resume. But when I was applying to jobs here, I literally just like Googled CV formats and reformatted my resume. I think I had to add a picture, and I had to add like a personal statement that I didn't have on my resume. But it's pretty similar, and I think I used like the Purdue OWL website as a guide, and that was fine.
Yeah, I haven't seen any differences here in terms of resumes or CVs. I would just make a quick shout out for keeping, I don't know if it's like recommended resume or CV template now, but keeping something, at the bottom that's, your personal interests. Cause I would just say at least over my career, how many times that's been super valuable, and somebody pointing out something that I had down there, and like it becomes a big part of the conversation and a way to create a personal connection. So just random thought there.
That's very true. I remember, to add to that point, in my personal interest, I think I had scuba diving as one of them. And that, honestly, that one came up a lot, and people were very interested in talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a question. Oh, sorry, Paul.
Nope, go ahead, Rachel.
Okay. Thank you all for taking the time to speak with us today. My name is Rachel. I'm a junior. And just for some context, I'm studying HOD Bio and English. So I'm like all over the place, which is why I tend to be confused. But so you all were kind of mentioning some like positives of, living abroad, like that you gleaned from travels or things. And of course there are positives and negatives, but what are some sort of like red flags, or I guess like green flags, that you all would say are a good sign that you should seriously consider actually living abroad versus, studying abroad, or, just going on vacation or things like that?
Really good question. I need a minute.
I mean, I guess I would just say, like, if you think about your personality, are you more like sort of adventurous and willing to be embarrassed a little bit? Because I within 3 days of moving here, I had an 80-year-old woman yelling at me because I put my feet up on the tram, and that was a big no-no. And it's a very self-policing, society, and that was really embarrassing. But like, obviously it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge deal, but those things can like have, sort of an impact. So I just think about like sort of, the sort of willingness to explore.
Absolutely. 100% about that embarrassment, or those moments when you go, oh, just cringe. I'm sure we all have similar stories. I remember being at a friend's place, and we were taking out the garbage, and I took the garbage in what I thought was the garbage. And then this little old French lady is yelling at me because apparently I put the garbage in the recycling. They take recycling very seriously here. I didn't know. And unfortunately, my French wasn't good enough for me to be able to explain that I didn't know. So I just kind of was like, désolé. But no, I think that having the comfort in the discomfort, and in those experiences that do push you out of your comfort zone, and knowing that this doesn't feel super comfortable, and it would be easier if I stayed in my home country, but that I'm going through this experience and it's going to be better and I'm going to learn from it. I think leaning into that discomfort, I think that's really a key. And I mean, that's why I'm still abroad, because I've learned more about myself. I've gained friendships that I never would have thought possible. I've learned about even the nuances of different cultures. And Michael mentioned this, but when you read on the news, it's very different than when you live, or when you meet people who have lived in different countries and you say, oh, but this world event happened. Tell me from your perspective how it was. And I think that has changed my life. It's changed the way I look at the news. It's changed the way I ingest media. It's changed the way I have conversations, and even the way that I think and read literature. So highly recommend if you have the opportunity. But I also do think that it's also not for everybody. And I think that if that's not for you, then that's completely okay too.
Yeah, and I'm sure it also, I agree with everything they said, especially just like it can be really hard and lonely sometimes. But another thing is that, of course, it depends a lot on the place. And so I know sometimes in like the Facebook expat groups, there are people, they're like, hi, we're thinking about moving to Copenhagen. And they will get responses from people who are very disillusioned here, who are like, well, before you come, you better think about this, because there are downsides. And I mean, like one here in Denmark is it is dark and cold for like 6 months. And so coming from Texas, it is actually very difficult. And a lot of people are like, I mean, they're the happiest country in the world sometimes, but they also take a lot of vitamin D in the winter, antidepressants. And so, I mean, it is like place specific, and there are going to be different downsides to everywhere that you live. And so I would try to do your research, maybe connect with other expats who are there and find out like the uncensored, what do you actually not like? Because we can talk about the great things all day long, but there are some things that really do impact kind of your quality of life depending on what's important to you and how you function best, I guess.
Great, thank you. There's another question in chat. Is there a difference in how immersed you are in the culture and how local you are when you're studying versus when you work abroad?
That's a good question. I might pass on that because when I was studying abroad, I lived with a family, so I felt super immersed and maybe, yeah, even more immersed than now. So yeah, maybe Alana and Jennifer have better context.
My summer program in Copenhagen was actually really, really short, and I lived with other study abroad students, so I was not immersed at all. I mean, I still work in an English-speaking workplace. My husband and I speak English, even though he's Danish. So I still kind of feel like I have to make an effort. That wouldn't be the case if I worked in like a Danish workplace. But I mean, definitely I'm more immersed now than I was when I was studying abroad, because that was for sure a little bubble. But I do still think it can be really easy to fall into expat communities and not really connect with locals. So yeah, if you're willing to make the effort, you can definitely get more immersed when you're actually living here. But study abroad was, for me, a bubble, definitely.
100%. Yes, study abroad was, I think it was also, there weren't as many of the adult concerns that I would have had when I studied abroad. Granted, I did it in China, now I live in France, but you don't have to think about visas. You don't have to think about looking for your apartment, or my electricity doesn't work, or my toilet is clogged, why don't I have hot water, et cetera, et cetera. It's very much a bubble, and you're living with people and students, and you're having fun, and it's maybe a first experience abroad. But then I think, actually, Alana had a really great point about being in that expat bubble even after. And I think that it's very easy to fall into that because everybody's speaking a language, maybe you share cultural similarities, and it's just a lot easier. But I think for me, the biggest difference was when I quit my job and studied French for a year. Now that I speak French, and I feel so much more integrated because I don't have to cling to that, because I can have friends who are French and I can speak French and we can do French things, and I don't have to feel like I'm not able to do that. And so I think that the language was really helpful to learn to be empowered. But at the same time, even before I was speaking French, I did meet people, and I was able to see that. I know that French people sometimes have a reputation as being a bit snobby or being a bit cold, which is not completely false. Being married to a Frenchman, I can say. But there are people who are going to be kind and patient and who will help you, and who, even if it's just a random stranger at the bakery and you're having trouble ordering and they help you. So that's there too. So yes, the language is important. Yes, integration is important, but I think it's important to remember, especially now that there are kind people all over the world and that we all kind of share that same commonality too. But yeah, big difference between being in the bubble, but you can also still be in a bubble when you go to work abroad. I think it's a matter of really being mindful and pushing yourself out of that bubble, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone to be immersed into, if that's what you want.
Great. Thank you to our three panelists, Alana, Michael, Jennifer, again, for spending your evening with us. I want to be mindful of everybody's time, so I want to go ahead and wrap this up. Just a reminder, the session was recorded, and we will have it up on Doorways available in just a day or two once we get video trimmed and everything uploaded. So students, thank you for participating. Wonderful questions. And feel free to shoot Parrish and I an email if you have any other ideas or thoughts on workshops. Panelists, thank you again. Students, we don't want to give a little silent clap for them, but I hope everyone has an awesome rest of their week. And again, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.